Good day, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to the 10th webinar in our local and subnational government information series. We are really thrilled to have you all in attendance and to gather together virtually today. Given the current context and acknowledging that COVID-19 has probably affected everyone in attendance in one way or another, it's wonderful that we can still gather on these important topics and make use of these virtual platforms to do so. So thank you for joining us. We're really looking forward to the webinar ahead. And today we are going to be looking at some reflections from the second meeting of the open-ended working group from the local and subnational government constituencies perspective. So let me start by introducing myself. My name is Timothy Blatch and I am an urban planner, but I work in ICLEI's Cities Biodiversity Centre based in ICLEI's Africa office in Cape Town, South Africa, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. Before we get started, just some general house rules, just to inform everyone that the webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available once the webinar is over. We will also include links to any documents or resources mentioned during the webinar in a follow-up email with the recording. We are going to have a number of presentations in the webinar, and then we are going to open the floor right at the end for some questions and discussion. And there are a few ways that you can ask questions. In the panel on your right, you will see that there's an option to raise your hand. Please do so, and we will then unmute you to ask a question when we open for discussion. Alternatively, you can use the chat box also in the panel on your right at any point throughout the webinar. Just to let you know, you can also write to us via email, and we will provide the email addresses to do so to get in touch with us. So what you're seeing on your screen now is essentially the process in a nutshell towards the vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. And this just shows the various processes that have led us to this point, 2020, this critical year for nature, and all the processes that will then run from 2020 onwards. So as I've said before, welcome and thank you for joining us. I've introduced myself, and I'd like to just take this opportunity to introduce our two panelists for today. Neither of them are strangers to this webinar process, and both of them have presented many times before. But we're really privileged to have Ingrid Coetzee with us, and she is our Senior Manager at ICLEI Africa and also in the Cities Biodiversity Centre. And Ingrid has had a long career in all things nature-based solutions, biodiversity, a focus on environmental law. And Ingrid, we are really privileged to have you talking with us today. We also have a presentation by Harriet Barclay. She was live in this morning's webinar. This afternoon, she's unable to join us physically, but we will play the recording from this morning's webinar of Harriet's inputs. And Harriet is a professor of geography at both Utrecht and Durham universities. And she's also the coordinator of the H2020 Naturevation project. So we are lucky and privileged enough to work with Harriet on quite a few fronts. And it's always wonderful when she's able to join us and provide her insights and perspective as she will today. So just to run over the agenda very quickly, I've already covered point one. I will hand over to Ingrid in a second, and she will give some feedback from the Sao Paulo Bio 2020 event that took place in February, very shortly after our previous webinar. And Ingrid will also give some feedback on the process around the second meeting of the open-ended working group, and will provide an overview of the statements that were made and how our constituency was represented there in Rome. And then I will play a pre-recording of Harriet Barclay, and she will also give some reflections on what this means in light of the draft Global Biodiversity Framework in terms of the action agenda and where we are in terms of overall implications for the local and subnational government constituency. Thereafter, I will hand back over to Ingrid, who will talk a little bit about the process going forward in light of the COVID-19 global pandemic, what this means for our timeline and roadmap, before we open the floor for some questions and discussion at the end. So just to mention that ICLEI is the focal point to the 3 Rio conventions on behalf of the Global Task Force of Local and Regional Governments. And one of these conventions is the CBD, which is very much the process that we're talking about today and in this entire webinar series. So what you can see on your screen now is the series for the year. So that we have monthly webinars where we keep the constituency and our partners up to date. And these are the dates for the rest of the year. And all these dates are available on our dedicated platform, which we will also share the links to and make available. We encourage you to please register for the remaining webinars and for the upcoming webinars to get them into your diaries, and we really thank you for joining us in this really important process. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ingrid, and as I've mentioned, she will give us an overview of the Sao Paulo event as well as open-ended working group 2. So over to you, Ingrid. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Tim, and greetings to everybody from Cape Town. I'm going to start, Tim, if you can move to the next slide, talking about the Bio 2020 event. And just to locate ourselves along the timeline, you'll see if the timeline spanning from the left of your screen to the right. We started in 2019. We're about a quarter of a way in 2020, where that red star is, and the 2 events that I'm talking about are to the bottom of the line. The one is the Sao Paulo event, the small circle at the beginning, just under 2020, and then open-ended working group 2, which is just below the red star. So if you can move on to the next slide, please, Tim. So the Bio 2020 event, which was held in Sao Paulo, Brazil, in the first week of February, was a very important milestone along the global advocacy roadmap for local and subnational governments, in that it was a gathering of all levels of subnational government within Brazil. The original idea had been that we wanted to also involve cities and subnational governments from other Lusophone countries, but because at that time in the early February there was already concern around the spread of the COVID virus, and people were concerned about travel restrictions, etc. We didn't have Lusophone countries represented, but we had a very good representation from Brazil and from South America. So this event was hosted by a number of organizations, including ICLEI, specifically our South America office, the Sao Paulo state government, Regions 4, and it was also an event that was supported by the Post-2020 Biodiversity Framework Support Project, which is coordinated by Expertise France. And there were a range of other Brazilian institutions across different levels of government that supported the event. You can see they are listed there, including the GIZ, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, etc. It was a really big event of more than 200 delegates, and this consisted of high-level representation. For example, we had governors, mayors, heads of institutions from all of the different Brazilian territories, as well as municipalities, states, the metropolitan regions, as well as biosphere reserves, which are an important institution in Brazil. And besides the government representatives, there were representatives from the private sector, from academia, civil society, as well as the youth and traditional communities. The aim of this particular event was to formulate and consolidate the Brazilian perspective on key points related to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Next slide. Now, there were several important outcomes from the event, and the most significant of this was the signing of the Carta de Sao Paulo, which is a document that is in the form of a letter or carta. And this was signed by Marcos Penido, who is the Secretary for Infrastructure and Environment from Sao Paulo State Government, and supported by all of the delegates attending. And it is significant in the sense that it highlights or it calls for three major things. In the first place, it calls for reinforcing multi-level integration in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And it strongly recommends that the CBD parties revise the existing plan of action for local and subnational governments that was adopted in 2010. And in this regard, the third main call coming from this Carta is that it calls for an improved and stepped up plan of action that has a specific mechanism for local and subnational engagement in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And this is really important given the context of Brazil, but also the whole wider CBD process, because it's the first time where we see some real strong calls and ambitions being made by the local and subnational government constituency. And you'll see on the right-hand side in the photograph there, we have representatives up on stage of some of the major institutions and support institutions, and the gentleman on to the right hand of the picture that is holding up the book is actually a carta, is Marcos Penido, who is the Secretary for Infrastructure and Environment. This is taken just after he signed it. Move on, please. Next slide. So then the second sort of major outcome of the Bio 2020 event is that a number of subnational governments signed up to Cities with Nature. Now, the significance of this intervention or initiative is that Cities with Nature, as we have reported previously on these webinars, is an online platform which is endorsed by the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity as being the official platform for cities and all levels of subnational governments to share and report on their actions and commitments to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And by signing up, these cities and state governments in Sao Paulo then indicated their commitments as well, joining with many, many other cities around the world. And so what we saw happening at the event was that Sao Paulo state itself signed up to Cities with Nature, as well as the federal district in Brazil, plus all of the 26 state capitals in Brazil committed to joining up to Cities with Nature. Obviously, this is an ongoing process, but already at the event, we saw that 15 of the 26 capital states actually signed up and joined Cities with Nature. And you see they are listed there on the screen. If we can move to the next slide. So we move on now to the Open-Ended Working Group 2 meeting. In one of our previous webinars last year, we reported on the Open-Ended Working Group 1 meeting, which was held in the middle of last year in Nairobi, Kenya. And this meeting was the follow-up, the second of these meetings of the Open-Ended Working Group, which the CBD has instituted to run the consultation and negotiation processes around the new Global Biodiversity Framework. It was initially scheduled to have taken place in Kunming in China, China being the host city, the host country for the next COP, COP15. But because of the spread and outbreak of the COVID-19 virus in China, it was decided to move the event from China to Italy, but keep the dates stayed the same. And so then between the 24th and the 29th of February, the Open-Ended Working Group the second meeting was conducted at the FAO headquarters in Rome. And the significance of this particular open-ended working group meeting is that it represented the first round of negotiations on the new global biodiversity framework, which is currently being negotiated. The zero draft of this framework had been circulated to CBD parties and stakeholders a few weeks previously in the middle of January. And this was then the first opportunity for the CBD parties to engage in a negotiation around the content and the text of the zero draft. It was despite the fact that obviously there was concern around the spread of the virus, etc. It was attended by over 700 delegates, 741 to be exact. And this represented a large representation from CBD parties, as well as non-parties. There were all of the UN specialized agencies were represented. There was a very big contingency of intergovernmental organizations, as well as NGOs. The Indigenous people and local community sector was also represented, as well as the youth sector, academia, business and community, and obviously also the local and subnational government constituency. And in the picture on the right, you can see the interior of the FAO meeting hall. This is the plenary of the first day, and it was a very full and packed hall, and there really wasn't enough seating for everybody. It was really a very important and well-attended meeting. Next slide. So to get back to the representation of the local and subnational government constituency, it was very well represented by the major networks. That included ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainable Development, specifically the Cities Biodiversity Centre, then also the European Committee of Regions, the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments and Biodiversity. This advisory committee is coordinated by Regions for Sustainable Development and the Government of Quebec, and also the group of leading subnational governments towards Aichi biodiversity targets. Now, the important thing about the representation of this constituency was that we got together. It was a very well sort of coordinated and cooperative group of representatives there. We got together every morning to plan and to coordinate our interventions and our positions, and we actually worked very well as a coalition of subnational and local government representatives. In the picture there on the right, you can see some of us. Unfortunately, when we took the picture, not everybody in the group was present, but you will see also that we had a specific seating allocation, which was important in the sense that it allowed us to get together and have a special seat, and it shows also the level of recognition for subnational and local governments. Next slide, please. So as part of the strategy amongst ourselves of the coalition of local and subnational government networks, we decided on making 3 strategic interventions, and we agreed to do this in the opening plenary. We were given a slot and a time to do this. We had about 6 minutes. And then we felt the next strategic intervention would be in the plenary dealing with item 4. That is the item that opened the discussion on the Global Biodiversity Framework, which took place on the 25th of February. And we agreed that our final intervention would be in the closing plenary on the 29th of February. And as part of the sort of collaboration and cooperation amongst ourselves in the coalition, we agreed on the text of each of these interventions. We drafted it together, and then we, in the third place, also agreed on who would read the particular statement on behalf of the local and subnational government constituency. So the opening statement was read by myself representing ICLEI on behalf of the whole group of local and subnational government networks. and then Jean Lebier from Quebec, and a representative of the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments read the second statement, and the closing statement was read by Hiroko Mizuno from IFIC Prefecture, also representing goals on the in the final closing plenary. And just briefly, just to highlight some of the issues, the salient issues presented in each of these statements. In our opening plenary, we reported on what we had done to date and our commitments and our ambitions, and we focused on appealing to the parties to strengthen existing mechanisms and implement previous commitments, but obviously also to strengthen the role of local and subnational governments. And we encouraged them to, for example, report and commit to reporting their ambitions and actions, and to using cities of nature and the future regions of nature platforms. And we also referred to other mechanisms such as the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity. In the second statement read on the Global Biodiversity Framework, we basically summed up some of the salient points that have been made by ourselves as a collective, but also under our individual network affiliations on the Zero draft, and we highlighted how we felt it could be improved to more efficiently and effectively reflect the contribution and role of local and subnational governments in the new global biodiversity framework. So, for example, we talked about some of the action targets and some of the other measures. And finally, in the third intervention, the closing intervention, we again referred to the fact that we are calling for a renewed plan of action, and we specifically recognized some of the contributions made by the CBD parties during the course of the Open-Ended Working Group 2 meeting. You can move on to the next slide, please. So I think one of the important things about the Open-Ended Working Group 2 meeting is that while there definitely was a level of concern and to some extent disappointment about the ambition maybe not being clear or strong enough, and certainly still a lot of uncertainty and vagueness around how a lot of the detail would be articulated, and people felt that there wasn't enough clarity around what was meant by transformative change, and some of the targets were too vague or too open-ended. We did see that insofar as reference to the role and contribution of local and subnational governments, we saw a tightening of the wording. So in the first open-ended working group in Nairobi last year, there were several, I think it was about 17 or 18 CBD parties that made some reference to the role of local and subnational governments, but these references were quite tentative. And what we saw at Open-Ended Working Group 2 was, although there was a smaller group of countries that made statements around local and subnational governments, those statements were far more specific and far more ambitious in terms of what they were asking. And this is particularly the statements made by the EU, the UK, Japan, Mexico, Singapore, Argentina, and some others, where there was a clearer call for participation, active participation, and not just recognizing local and subnational governments, but actually calling for participation by these levels of government in the implementation of the new framework. So, for example, on the Thursday the 27th, the fourth plenary session, which dealt with specifically sections E to H of the draft Zero Global Biodiversity Framework, And these sections cover issues such as solutions for implementation, mainstreaming, enabling conditions, transparency, outreach, etc. There was a very clear call, intervention made by the UK government, in which they were proposing a new point should be added to the enabling conditions section, which specifically makes reference to active involvement of subnational governments, cities and local authorities, and the recognition of their devolved responsibility for implementation of the framework. And this is the first time we were seeing this level of detail and specificity coming out in statements from countries. Likewise, Japan called for involving the relevant regional instruments, subnational and local governments in implementation, and they supported the points made by the UK government. And similarly, we got strong statements coming from the EU, Singapore, Argentina, and Mexico. We unfortunately don't have enough time in this webinar to go into all of these specificities, but it really was, I think, significant to see that countries are becoming a lot clearer in terms of what role they foresee for subnational and local governments. Next slide, please. So, for example, the Friday, there was a contact group session, which focused on tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. And this dealt with Target 13. And we saw there very clear statements being made by the CBD focal points from Canada, Argentina, and Mexico. There was a very lively discussion during that contact group with a number of text proposals being discussed and refined. And the majority of these made a very clear reference to local and subnational governments. And the co-lead of the contact group summed it up by asking parties to consider a specific wording, which is captured on the slide there. And essentially, this is a recommended amendment of the version that was captured in the draft 0, which, if you read it, you'll see it says, integrate biodiversity values into national and local planning, development processes, poverty reduction strategies, and accounts, ensuring by 2030 that biodiversity values are mainstreamed across all sectors, and that biodiversity inclusive strategic environmental assessments and environmental impact assessments are comprehensively applied. And I think something else that stood out from the discussions on implementation and mainstreaming is that there was a recognition from the CBD parties that within the long-term approach to mainstreaming, there is also a goal that is very similar to this action target. And specifically that mainstreaming is an important means for implementation and should be a key priority for GBF. We can move on to the next slide, please. So in the closing plenary, there was also a call or a reference specifically to local and subnational governments, and this was led by New Zealand on behalf of a group of non-EU developed countries, where they specifically argued for the need to involve subnational and local governments in providing a roadmap for transformative actions suited to biodiversity conservation. I mentioned the mainstreaming previously or just now, and I think what is significant coming from Open-Ended Working Group 2 is that in the report presented by the Informal Advisory Group on mainstreaming, which was done on the 24th of February during the afternoon plenary session, there were 3 key points that are relevant to local and subnational governments. The first of this is that mainstreaming lies at the core of implementing the whole of government approach, with which is obviously one of the central elements and principles of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. A second point that was made in this report on mainstreaming is that all actors should cooperate in reversing biodiversity loss. And with all actors, there's specific reference to actors at the global and regional levels, but national levels, but also subnational and local levels. And then the third main point was that within the draft long-term approach to biodiversity mainstreaming, there is a goal that specifically talks about the subnational levels of government. And I think what is important is to understand that the emphasis on local and subnational governments within the long-term approach to biodiversity mainstreaming, the LTAM, is that this is due largely to the representation by this constituency through ICLEI, which sits on the informal advisory group, but also other networks such as Regions 4 that are represented on the extended consultative network. So their representations are being picked up and incorporated into the proposed long-term approach to biodiversity mainstreaming. Thank you. Next slide. And I can now hand over to Tim again. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ingrid, and thank you for your contributions. It's always wonderful to hear from you, and thank you for providing such an excellent reflection on the open-ended working group and an update of what happened with relevance to the local and subnational government constituency there. So without further ado, I'm going to virtually hand over to Harriet Barclay, and as I mentioned, she joined us in this morning's session live, and I'm going to play her input as a recording now. So if you'll bear with me for 1 second.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks, Ingrid, also for giving us such a great overview of the overall process. So, yeah, what I wanted to do is just share a little bit of my perspectives on where we got to with the city's agenda at the end of the meeting in Rome. And next slide, please, Tim. Yeah, so I was thinking, well, how far over the last year have we come in terms of shifting the dial, thinking about the different roles that cities can play? Are we kind of heading towards some more kind of transformative role for cities in the post-2020 framework, and what does that look like? So I've divided my comments into 3 things here, and then I'll move to thinking about what the action agenda, another aspect of the post-2020 framework might it help us kind of move forward even further. So I think we can see that the dial is definitely shifting in terms of how cities, subnational governments more generally are kind of thought about in relationship to the biodiversity issue. I mean, if historically we can say that for the majority of those involved in the conservation agenda, urbanization and cities in particular have been thought about as a kind of threat to biodiversity, encroaching on land near cities which has biodiversity value and converting that into urban land. And now what's one of the most interesting things is that the sort of move away from just seeing cities as a threat to biodiversity, but actually as a space of opportunity for acting towards biodiversity goals. So we can see a growing interest in harnessing nature-based solutions. Of course, I'm particularly interested in that given my research background. Maybe I tend to be a little bit biased towards looking at that issue, but it's certainly something that was very prominent on the agenda at the open-ended working that the convention and the framework, and if you like, the narrative around it is still struggling with, is how to show cities that biodiversity is an opportunity for them. So maybe Biodiversity Convention is increasingly thinking of cities as an opportunity for biodiversity, but I think in order to really galvanize and engage cities going forward, we're going to need to show how acting on biodiversity really matters for kind of core urban business. And there's ways of doing that, but I'm not sure that we're there yet. I think in the second issue then is this idea of moving from the margins to the mainstream, and Ingrid gave a really nice account of all of the different ways in which the kind of mainstreaming of local and subnational action was talked about at the event. And so I don't need to go over those details for you, but just in terms of my own perspective, I think we see an increasing focus on multi-level governance. It's also one of my own research interests, and has been very effective in the climate change regime over the last 20 years in terms of creating the space for urban action. And I think it's a very important first step, is that multi-level governance is regarded as a way in which biodiversity can be managed, can be governed. And then we also saw lots of very specific kind of calls for cities to be involved in planning and in implementing action on the ground. So I do think that whole of government approach is really beginning to stick now, and it will be vital for the actual success of the final convention. But again, I think there's another step to take for the full potential of cities to be realized here, which is to recognize that cities and subnational governments aren't only implementers of policies and actions decided elsewhere. So they don't only translate that into planning frameworks and enforce them, but they come up with all sorts of different interventions, innovations, approaches to managing biodiversity themselves, which should also be able to find space as good mechanisms for governing biodiversity. So that, I think, we need, the self-governing part of cities and the way in which cities have multiple different capacities for governing has not yet fully been captured, and that's quite tricky to do within the confines of the legal agreement of the post-2020 framework, and that might be where the action agenda comes to be more important. I'll speak about that a bit later. And then this third aspect, and Ingrid also mentioned it, a sort of slight sense of disquiet, really, that perhaps the sort of promises that the post-2020 framework would deliver a kind of transformative agenda for biodiversity governance, the kind of agenda that was called for by the IPBES global assessment of the loss of nature and biodiversity that was released around about a year ago now, which told us that we needed transformative change if we were going to get to the kinds of outcomes that the biodiversity governance framework is trying to achieve. And here I think the convention and the convention process is struggling rather more. There still remains quite a focus on the direct impact of urbanization on biodiversity, but also on more generally on the direct drivers of biodiversity, and all the targets to address the indirect drivers, such as addressing pollution, thinking about production and consumption, and climate change are there. They are often the most controversial, they have the least consensus behind them, and if there's perhaps a question about how, if the phrasing that's in there at the moment continues, they may remain rather lacking in teeth to kind of bite on those issues. So while there was a growing recognition that indirect drivers had to have a place within the framework, I think one of the most interesting things to me was that it was in those spaces that the cities element or the subnational element tended to fade out from view. So, for example, there's a target aimed at reducing pollution, and one of the aspects of that is waste and plastic pollution. But there was no mention by any party of the critical role, and in fact the fundamental role, that local government plays in managing waste and indeed plastic pollution on the ground. Local government, subnational government run pretty much everywhere are waste management systems, but that wasn't kind of considered in the discussion. So I think that, if the push towards more transformative change happens, it will be crucial that the role of cities and subnational governments gets considered as really central to addressing those indirect drivers. Next slide, please, Tim. And so this brings me to this kind of consideration of what goes by the name of the action agenda. And some of you may have heard about this before, and I'm sure that it's been discussed in this forum. that at the last Conference of the Parties, which was held in Egypt, a year and a half ago now, there was an idea to have this action agenda where the whole of society could make commitments towards biodiversity goals. And it was the idea that it would be on the road from Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt to Kunming this year, that this action agenda would gather momentum and collect the commitments of a whole host of different actors. And now that process seems to have been relatively slow to start from the Biodiversity Convention Secretariat. I mean, there is some platform where commitments can be made, but it hasn't really gathered much momentum yet. But what was really interesting about the meeting in Rome was that so many non-state actors, and of course all of the work that ICTY and its partners are doing, shows that the action agenda is very much alive and kicking. It just perhaps rather uncoordinated at the moment. There's lots and lots of different initiatives happening, business groups leading new initiatives for commitments, the finance sector having new commitments, of course, lots of different things happening in this space as well. And I suppose here the question is, how is this actually going to come together so that we can really account for and also build trust in all of these different kinds of commitments that are happening on the ground, and whether they, whether we can really make them add up to contribute to the global goals for biodiversity. Next slide, please, Tim. Yeah, so I mean, I think the action agenda potentially provides us with a really interesting place to try to address the sort of challenging times that we have at the moment. Knowing that all of our different kinds of local conditions will be really changing a lot, I think alongside the kind of building commitments into the framework in the way that Ingrid and the coalition have been doing and so successfully, making sure that the action agenda provides a space where cities can, in their different capacities and undergoing very different circumstances and conditions, can make a commitment and can get on board with this agenda will also be important. And Tim mentioned that the Cities with Nature platform is seeking to go into that direction in the next few months as we develop a commitment platform there. And I think that will be a really critical part of getting this right. So I think more than ever in the current circumstances, we're going to need to show that working on biodiversity is creating other kinds of opportunities for society and for our cities, and that we can capture that opportunity both through this new decision and this idea of, fully recognizing the role of subnational government and cities and local government in the convention, but also making sure that we have this kind of robust space in the action agenda to kind of harness the creativity and the innovation that cities can also bring to this question. So yeah, so that's just a few reflections from me. I hope they're a useful perspective for the rest of you. So
as always, I would just want to take this opportunity to really thank Harriet for her inputs. She has been part of this process from the beginning with us and walked this journey. And she always brings such an insightful viewpoint. So in her absence, Harriet, thank you for joining us. And as Harriet mentioned, on Cities with Nature, we are in the process of developing a commitment platform for cities and regions and all levels of subnational governments. This commitment platform is in line with the draft of the global framework and makes an attempt at translating those goals and targets into urban actions where cities and regions can make various commitments and set targets that will form the basis of a really robust and exciting monitoring and reporting system that will all happen on Cities with Nature. So for those who are joining us on the call who are representatives of cities, I just want to quickly take this opportunity to invite you to join us, to register on Cities with Nature, and to really join the journey and be a part of this exciting space. So I'm going to hand back over to Ingrid now, and Ingrid is just going to give us some thoughts on looking ahead for the rest of the year, how the COVID-19 pandemic is shifting some of the timeframes, and in relation to the upcoming events, what this will mean for how we engage with the participatory process. So Ingrid, on that note, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and you can move into the next slide. I think the issue is that, yes, the pandemic has certainly affected the negotiation and consultation process in that we've seen some of the milestone events having to be shifted on in time. But what it hasn't affected is the determination to continue with the discussion and the negotiation in different formats, in online formats, etc. So if you look at the timeline, you'll see to the right of that red star, which is where we are currently, you'll notice on the top line, there are a couple of events. The first is the one I'm going to focus on just now, and that is the thematic workshop for subnational, regional, and local governments, which is going to be taking place virtually through online platforms from the middle of April to the middle of May. Then there's a series of other events, and if you look further right, you'll see there's a much bigger circle, a dot, and that is the SABSTA 24 event. Now, that initially was going to be taking place in May, and that has moved to late in August, the last week of August. And immediately to the right of it, just below the dotted line, this SBI meeting, number 3, is going to be taking place in the first week of September. So those two are the next major meetings that the CBD is organizing. And those are really important from the negotiation process perspective, particularly the SBI one, because that's where the next sort of negotiations will take place. And many of the technical issues that were deferred from Open-Ended Working Group 2 to SABSTA will obviously then come under discussion at SBI 3. If you look to the left of that SBI 3 dot, you'll see the IUCN World Conservation Congress. That is still scheduled for the second week of June. It's currently to be confirmed. There hasn't been a final decision around whether that's going ahead. But as soon as we have confirmation, we will keep our constituency members informed. And you'll see on the screen there are a number of other events that are also included on this timeline. And as far as the Open-Ended 3 working group is concerned, which is immediately to the right of the SBI 3 dot, that date hasn't been confirmed. The idea is still that it will take place, but the actual time frame hasn't been set. And the same with the COP meeting, the COP 15, which the date is still to be confirmed. It was scheduled to take place in the second half of October this year in China, in Kunming. And there has been an announcement from the CBD that they will finalize that date at some stage. There is some talk that it will be only taking place earlier next year, but that has not yet been confirmed. Tim, if you could move on to the next slide. What I did want just to focus on a little bit this afternoon is the next big event that's coming up in the roadmap for local and subnational governments, and that is the thematic consultation specifically for our constituency that is being organized by the Government of Scotland in partnership with a whole range of local and subnational government networks and 7 other major stakeholders. Now, the initial idea was that this would be an event that would run over 3 days in the first week of April, but because of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had to shift gears in terms of how this event is going to take place. And it essentially, in order to allow for sort of equitable participation by the local and subnational governments, what the organizers have agreed is that instead of being a 3-day event, it'll now take the form of a longer process, an online process, which will consist of a series of webinars, sort of plenary webinars around the main focal areas, being the post-2020 framework, the draft, the subsequent draft of the zero draft, a declaration that will come out of these consultations, which is being called the Edinburgh Declaration, and then importantly the renewed plan of action for local and subnational governments. And these are, this is going to be, the idea is that this will take the form of an introductory or webinars that will be held regionally within the week of 13 April. And the reason why it's being held regionally is to accommodate different time zones. So the same webinar will be presented in Asia, for the Asia region, for the African region, for Europe and North America, and then for South America. This will be augmented by a series of thematic webinars, which will run roughly across the period of 13 April to the 8th of May. And you'll see to the right-hand side of the screen in the green box, there's a couple of themes mentioned: nature-based solutions, the climate biodiversity linkages, monitoring and reporting, capacity building, resource mobilization, etc. At the same time, there will be opportunity for consultation and comment on the Edinburgh Declaration, on the proposals for a renewed plan of action, which will be in the format of an online questions and opportunity to make comments. And this will run for approximately 4 weeks between 13 April and the 4th of May. Just in terms of the proposal around a plan of action, what I wanted to mention is that ICLEI, together with its coalition of partners, Regions 4, European Committee of Regions, the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments, and the group of leading subnational governments toward IQ biodiversity targets, are currently in the process of doing a review of the 2010 Plan of Action. This review has 3 main elements. In the first place, we are looking at what was achieved by CBD parties, by all levels of subnational government, and by major stakeholders in terms of the current plan of action. So what have we done? In the second instance, we are looking at, there's an analysis of the successes and the weaknesses of the current plan of action. And the final part of the review is to come up with concrete recommendations for a renewed plan of action under the new global biodiversity framework. And obviously there one would need to align with the proposals coming out of the CBD process in terms of a new global biodiversity framework. And this is a document that will then be presented in the consultation session that I mentioned just now, and then also through the online comment facility. Stakeholders, people participating in this whole consultation amongst subnational governments will then get an opportunity to make comments. That will be collated towards the middle of May. And then finally, we are looking to have a second consultation, which will run round about the 11th of June. So if you look on the screen, there's a blue block just below the green one, and that is where the consultation results in terms of the draft post-2020 framework, as well as the Edinburgh Declaration, as well as the renewed plan of action, will be presented back to people that are participating in this process. And the idea is that ultimately this will then be presented at the SBI 3 meeting, which, as I said earlier, is scheduled to take place in the first week of September. And from SBI 3, the idea is that it will go forward to open-ended working group 3, the date of which is yet to be confirmed, and then ultimately culminating at COP15. And I think, Tim, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ingrid, and thanks for providing some clarity on the way forward. And this will certainly be an exciting time as we, together with our partners and with the constituency, experiment and pilot various virtual approaches to engagement. And we hope that these will be very successful. The slide on your screen right now just shows the details of the next webinar to take place on the 16th of April. The The registration link will be distributed in the follow-up email, as well as it's also available in the schedule of events for the year on our dedicated platform. And in relation to that platform, you can see the typical look of it in the top right-hand corner. And just to inform you that coming soon, we're working on a brand new website, the branding of which is shown at the bottom, and it will be titled Local and Subnational Advocacy for Nature. So watch this space as this website is released and improves the information and knowledge sharing throughout this process. So it's at this point in the webinar that I'm going to open the floor for any burning questions. I realize we don't have much time left, but if there are any questions, you can either raise your hand using the panel on the right, and we can unmute you, or you are welcome to type the question in the chat box. I'm just going to wait for a few seconds to see if there are any questions. And the floor is now open. If anyone would like to make an input, please raise your hand on the right. Okay, I think even if there aren't any questions for right now, oh, it looks like one may have come through. Ingrid, there's a question from Sunandan. He said, thanks Ingrid, very insightful. Which point or points would we now critically focus on as we move forward? I don't know if you'd like to respond to that quickly, Ingrid.
Yes, just briefly, I think the main focus now going forward is to articulate what it is around the plan of action. As I said, the concrete recommendations that need to be made and taken up for a renewed plan of action. And there's a couple of things there. There's obviously the content issues. What would the new plan of action look like in order to strengthen the role of local and subnational governments to be active participants in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework? But at the same time, there's also the process of how does one get this through. And then I think the second point of action or the point of focus is obviously going to be responding to the next version of the Global Biodiversity Framework, the one that will come out now following the Open-ended Working Group 2 consultations, and we just need to wait and see what comes from there. So I think those are the two things. The one is, specific comment in terms of the next version of the Global Biodiversity Framework and all its elements and components. And then the other one is focusing on the plan of action, the renewed plan of action under for the next decade.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. I'm just going to, if there's any other burning questions, I'll just wait for a few seconds before we close. Someone has a hand raised. Maria. Pedro, are you able to help me unmute Maria? Oh, there we are. Maria, you're unmuted. Hello.
Yes, appreciated very much. I wonder what Clay and the group would do about this prohibition of wild animals commercialization. This is the coronavirus brought up this problem now, coming from the hypothesis that it was originated from a wild animals market in China. So what's the position of Clay and Secretariat and the city's Biodiversity Center regarding this? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Maria, for your question. And Ingrid, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think that is a very pertinent and relevant question. One of the things that came out of the previous COP, there was a decision on the issue of wildlife trade, specifically in terms of the meat industry. And within that previous decision, there was a recognition of local governments and the role that they play. It's a tricky one because in most countries, in terms of the constitutional allocation of powers and mandates, but also specifically the biodiversity conservation legislation, the regulation of trade in wildlife is often something, or mostly something, that is regulated at the national level. And in many countries, the powers at local level are limited maybe to things like markets, control of markets, rather than regulating trade of threatened species, etc. I do think that going forward, this is something that is going to certainly be discussed in a lot more detail. Already at Open-Ended Working Group 2, we were seeing that there was quite a lot of discussion around what was happening in China. The Chinese had announced already by then that they were going to place a ban on trade. But how it will actually be operationalized within the implementation of the new framework, I think that's the sort of detail that needs to be worked out. But I do think that this is another case of where it just validates the role that local and subnational governments can play, because the local and subnational government levels is where the markets are, where the control over markets are. And clearly it indicates the need for a transversal and multi-level governance approach, and recognizing that the lower levels of government are not just stakeholders, but they're actually integral to making the implementation of the new framework successful, and that they are part and parcel of government and need to be recognized as such. So I think that what you've raised is a very pertinent but difficult question to answer, and I certainly hope that going forward, this is precisely the sort of concrete and more transformative actions that we're going to see coming forth. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. I'm mindful of the fact that we are out of time. I don't think that there's any other hands. Are there any other burning questions? I think with that, we will, I think there is a hand. No. Okay, with that, we are going to close this webinar. I just want to close by thanking both Ingrid and Harriet for their inputs, and to invite you all again to join us for the next webinar in the series in April, and to keep tabs on our dedicated website and platform. We will also be sharing, we've already sent out the first of our local and subnational advocacy for nature updates. These will come around monthly, so we will send a link to subscribe to those in the follow-up email. And as I mentioned, the recording of the webinar, as well as some key documents like the Carta that Ingrid mentioned coming out of the Sao Paulo event, we will share all of these details with you. So thank you to each and every one of you for joining us today, and we look forward to being all together in the next webinar. Stay safe and healthy, everyone, and thank you once again.